Dobry wieczór. Good evening, everyone. My name is Alexander. I'm going to be your host today. I wanted to welcome you to the Cooper Union. We're very proud to host this event together with Ukrainian Museum. It's a very important and very special event for all of us. In my role as the curator of Her Lubalin Study Center, which is essentially kind of organizing this within the Cooper Union, the study center is devoted to preserving artifacts of graphic design typography, which helps protect the history of visual culture, which is, I think, a very important part of why we're here, why I wanted to share this conversation tonight. The collection, which is located right across the hall there, consists of 70,000 objects, and it spans 135 years and 5 continents. It does include a growing collection of Ukrainian design, so if anyone would like to donate some Ukrainian graphic design to us, we would be very, very welcome to that. Talk to me after the event, but I would be happy to keep expanding. The collection is open to the public. There is no cost. Cooper Union will soon hopefully be free for everybody, but the Lubalin Center has been free for quite a while, and we like to keep it that way. All you have to do is just make an appointment, which is very easy. The Cooper Union and Lubalin Center together are very much committed to continue to stand with the Ukrainian people as they resist the Ukrainian invasion, the Russian invasion. A very important part of what I would like to open is, of course, thank the Ukrainian Museum for beginning this conversation and to start this roundtable series. This is the 3rd installment of the series, so I applaud their efforts, our neighbors, to start this conversation, continue to do this work, and I wanted to thank the entire staff there, but I want to single out Petro Doroshenko for your work in initiating this stuff and helping us continue these conversations and for partnering with us on this event. I also wanted to give a big thank you to Kalina Cholamboychuk for all the work in organizing this behind the scenes, and to Katarina Czartoryski, who designed a lot of the graphics for this. So thank you, and the rest of the staff in the museum. I do want to give you a sense of what today's roundtable will consist of, so you have a sense of timing and a sense of the framing of the overall discussion. I will begin by introducing the topic, giving a little bit of a framing for it. It'll then be followed by 3 short presentations by our esteemed panelists here, and then we'll have a moderated discussion, which will then allow a little bit of time at the end for questions from you. There's a microphone here, and because we're live streaming, we'll pass the microphone around, but for people watching on live stream, just make sure you're asking the question with a microphone so they can hear. If not, we'll repeat the question for those watching. So the panelists today are the 3 lovely folks on the side of the stage. Dr. Myroslav Shkandrij, who is the Professor Emeritus of Ukrainian Literature and Language at the University of Manitoba. He's currently at the Columbia University. Aliona Solomadina, to my right, a Kyiv-based graphic designer and researcher. And one more to the right, Yurko Gutsulyak, who is an award-winning graphic designer and a co-founder of Gutsulyak.Studio. The other part of the event is kind of the overall framing, which hopefully will sort of cover these four areas. Talking, of course, about decolonization, but decolonization in the context of national identity and the relationship between graphic design and visual communication to national identity, ideas of soft power, and topics around the role of individuals, institutions, and processes within decolonization efforts. Today marks the 631st day since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began on February 24th, 2022. It's remarkably difficult to frame how long it's been. It's a 1 year, 8 months, and 24 days. But it really has been 3,557 days or 9 years and 8 months and 28 days since the war really began back in 2014, when Russia first invaded the Donbas area and annexed Crimea from Ukraine. But the fight for independence in the lands of Ukraine dates much further back, of course, as we know, perhaps maybe as far back as the 9th century. And as we begin this discussion tonight, I want to highlight two aspects that will kind of run through, I think, the event tonight. We have to discuss the direct danger that Ukrainian culture is in right now, and decolonizing Ukrainian culture. Those two things are distinct, but obviously intertwined. It's a bit of a catch-22, if you will allow me that. You must have culture to decolonize it, and preserving culture makes it harder to colonize it by an adversary. As of November 2nd, 2023, UNESCO has verified damage to 327 sites since February 24th of 2022. 124 religious sites, 142 buildings of historical and artistic interest, 28 museums, 19 monuments, 13 libraries, and 1 archive. According to the statistics as of September 1st of this year, the total documented direct damage to Ukraine's infrastructure caused by full-scale Russian invasion has reached $151 billion. This is calculated in terms of replacement costs. This includes 167,200 housing units that have been destroyed. That is an unfathomable amount of destruction. The region of my birth, the city I was born in, Odessa, has suffered the second largest number of damage after the Donbas, with 47 distinct sites damaged or destroyed, which includes 4 museums. On November 5th of this year, actually last week, a Russian missile hit very close to the Odessa Fine Art Museum, literally right outside the doors, creating a massive crater and damaging the UNESCO World Heritage Site. It could have been much worse if the missile hit the museum itself. The damage that you're seeing here is from the shockwave. Imagine what would have happened if the missile moved just a little closer. It's a museum I'm very fond of. It's the museum I went most to when I was growing up in Odessa. The atrocities being committed by the intentionally anachronistic Russian war of aggression and the genocide perpetrated by Russian has expedited Ukraine in arriving to its current decolonial stage. But I would also go further and say that that the process itself of decolonizing has been gaining speed for the last several years, even before the full-scale invasion. We're here specifically to talk about decolonizing Ukrainian culture with the perspective on its design. In design, and more broadly, the visual communication play a vital role in this decolonizing process. Sometimes as the subject of decolonization, and often as the tool of decolonization itself. And I will extend that to other artistic fields, like fashion, architecture, interior design in Ukraine play a vital role in that. At the root of all visual communication design is language. Preserving language is preserving cultural identity. And I wanted to acknowledge the event that's coming up at the museum, which is the 4th event in this Decolonizing Roundtable series on December 7th at 7 p.m. at the museum, just around the corner, will be the 4th event specifically focusing on decolonizing Ukrainian language. Graphic design and visual communication is squarely rooted in language. It's hard to imagine graphic design, visual communication without language. But communication, especially design, is shaping culture and constructing cultural identity. In terms of its impact, it's also then being influenced by that very same culture. It takes a lot and it gives a lot as well. So it's this kind of endless loop between material. Cultural identity and iconography are intertwined and is ancient as most forms of communication, probably as back as cave paintings. In Ukraine, the signifiers of national identity are preserved from the very beginning and evolved the country as the country continued evolving. They're ever present and always very much a thing of its own. In talking about today's topic, I think it's an important idea that the printing, publishing, which is, quote, the art which will preserve all others, kind of a 17th century idea, design and visual communication is thus enabling the preservation of history and culture, catalyzing the process of decolonization and de-imperialization. And decolonization begins with reconsidering complex and often willfully distorted historical events. As this quote points out, it requires an institutional transformation that rearranges systems affected by the war's destruction. It permits a reconsideration of historically contested narratives, that establishment, and the establishment of new epistemological foundations through the active cultural production of new narratives. The following presentations by the three panelists here will give you some insight into the richness of Ukrainian art and design. In the contemporary West, there's a serious conflation of the broader, diverse culture into a homogenized, quote-unquote, Russian art and design. Part of the great Russian culture, in air quotes, makes it somehow untouchable and uncritically received and perceived by the West. These books are a very small sampling of a large number of books that exemplify the very thing that I mean. Obviously, as you can tell, everything is Russian avant-garde, despite the fact that there are many, many practitioners, not necessarily Russian. And if you even consider that technically, most of this is during the Soviet period. It willfully ignores art made in other areas or by artists from other parts of the colonizing Soviet Union. This is also a good example of soft power, which is very, very present and has been for a while. The reason it's so effective is from years of exerting soft power by Russia in the West, and the West has fallen in love with the avant-garde. It's a long process. Russia capitalizes on this fact to claim the entire movement as theirs, making it harder and harder for average person to feel critical of that state, to say nothing of the complicit financial ties of many art institutions to Russia itself. Ukraine at its art is quite varied. It's quite diverse and quite unique. Just looking at this very small sample of work that was made during the avant-garde period, which we just looked at the Russian sort of lens through that, you can see how varied and how diverse it is. It's not as homogeneous as the textbooks and the books that are written about the Russian avant-garde make it out to be. And as you will hear from Myroslav, there's a much more complex and diverse ideology behind that as well. Another curious thing about what's happening right now is the extent, within the extent of the war, is the absurdity of it all. This is a very important constructivist style architecture building built in Kharkiv between 1928 and 1932, kind of at the height of the avant-garde, or I guess you could say the height, the tail end perhaps of the Russian period of avant-garde, but begins a transition to Kharkiv and other places in Ukraine. This is a 90-year-old building that was damaged by a Russian missile attack by the very forces that claim to defend this avant-garde for the world. So it's very obvious how much they care about their own cultural heritage. Ukraine is and has always been diverse. It's not just that it shed its shackles in the last few years. It has always been there. It has always been diverse. And part of this decolonization has been very present there. The work by artists like Adolf Miron Cassandra on the left, Kazimir Malevich, Sonia Delaunay, and Volodymyr Tatlin in the photograph on the right with the bandura, which has very interesting architectural qualities that show up in his work later, are all examples of the rich Ukrainian design language. These are the roots of a lot of the avant-garde, and these are the roots where a lot of the Soviet and the kind of esteemed, rarefied work of avant-garde takes its shape. So to close out, the talk today by the three panelists will cover three distinct phases with overlapping territories. Myroslav is going to start. He'll talk about the roots of the Ukrainian design and avant-garde. Aliona will cover the Ukrainian design from 1917 to 1991, essentially the Soviet period. And Yurko will close the presentation phase, and he'll share an overview of the design in Ukraine post the 1991 independence in Ukraine. And in closing, I will close with this quote by Valentina Bachkovska, with this framing that today, in the midst of this war, overcoming the cultural appropriation of Ukraine in the global cultural space is happening with 7 League boots. It's very obvious how quickly the world has become aware and is paying attention. What seemed impossible and far-fetched yesterday is now being institutionalized. And that's why we're here, and that's why we're here to delve into. And my hope is that this event will play a part in that process. Thank you very much for joining us, and Slava Ukraini.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to Sasha. Thank you to the Cooper Union. It's an honor to be with such distinguished figures and to speak about Ukrainian art. I'm just a cultural historian, basically, but I began studying the avant-garde, the 1920s, and have continued to do that. The period from about 1910 to 1930 was an explosion of creativity in Ukraine. And Ukrainians were front and center in the avant-garde. Many people don't realize that. But if you think about it, David Burlyuk, the founder of Futurism in what was the Russian Empire, Futurism in Russia and Ukraine, Kazimir Malevich, the founder of Suprematism, Vladimir Tatlin, Alexandra Exter. These are major figures, not only in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, in Russia, but also in Europe as a whole. And that's one of the first points I want to make. The traffic and influences went not just from Paris to Kyiv. It did not go just from west to east. It went from east to west. It did not just go from north to south. It went from south to north. And so many of the people from Ukraine who became famous in the West traveled and brought their influence to Paris, Munich, Berlin, or to Moscow, St. Petersburg, and then traveled to other cities in Europe and to North America. So one of them was Alexandra Exter. She brought, as Leger said, she brought color to Cubism. She infused Cubism, or was one of the people that helped infuse Cubism with color. And there are distinct Ukrainian colors and a Ukrainian color scheme in much of her work. She was fascinated by folk art. She introduced a very famous collection of folk arts in 1918 in Kyiv. And she spoke about how important this color vibrancy and vitality of folk arts was in revitalizing design. Here is Exter's work in France in 1912, but she's better known for her work in Kyiv, for the color that she brought to her work in Kyiv. She was also instrumental in linking Paris to Kyiv and to Moscow. And she had a studio in Kyiv, which taught and brought together some of the best and most creative, most innovative artists of the day. Design for operas and theater performances, wonderful clothing, wonderful sets. She did these marvelous set designs. And she brought all this later to Paris, where she settled after 24. including these wonderful puppets that she did, some of them in Kyiv and then some later in the West. One of her friends was Bohomazov, Alexander Bohomazov, very little known in the West, but a remarkable artist who collaborated with her or worked closely with her, and they developed this dynamic form, these exploding centers, intersections of curves and lines, this dynamism of a city moving quickly. They developed together a Kyiv version of Cubo-futurism. And this was prior, in fact, to the First World War. Bohomazov, whose works have not been well shown in the West, and his theoretical works have not been discussed a great deal, but he had some interesting ideas. For example, space bending. Movement bends space, and when a streetcar runs through the road, the buildings move to the center. So he had these very interesting ideas about how perceptions change because of movement. Another brilliant artist that is also very little known in the West is Anatol Petritsky. He was actually of Jewish origin, but became almost a poster boy for Ukrainian design and Ukrainian portraiture in the 1920s. And then, of course, there were the people that made it in the West. From Kyiv came Alexander Archipenko, one of the people who put color into sculpture, and in fact created Cubist, an early creator of Cubist sculpture. Was in Berlin, was in Paris, and then moved to the United States. And his works, some of his works are right here in New York. These are extremely creative, unusual works for the time, which broke new ground in sculpture. Just to mention another artist from Odessa, Vladimir Baranov-Rossinet. This is his self-portrait. He traveled from Kherson, Kyiv, Paris, St. Petersburg, Moscow, and back to Paris. And his work, if you go to MoMA, is there. And Sonia Delaunay, who in her autobiography stated that, she came from Ukraine, and her early childhood in Ukraine had enormous influence on her view of color, on her exploration of different color dynamics and different textiles and folk designs. Volodymyr Tatlin, too. David Burlyuk was not only a founder of futurism in the Russian Empire, but he also was an enormous influence on how exhibitions were created. When he grew up in the Kherson area, he used to go and dig up burial mounds and find Scythian art, which were often, these were metal plates that he would turn in different directions because the imagery changed as you moved the plate around. And he took this idea into his graphic art. You can move these pictures around and see something from different sides. And of course, Meller. Vadim Meller was in Munich, where he studied for a while, and then he was enormously influential in creating the avant-garde theater of the 1920s, along with Lys Kurbas, the famous, brilliant theater director. These works hung in the studio of Bronislava Nijinská, who was in Kyiv in 1918, and who collaborated with, or met and worked closely with the other artists of the day. These works are now world famous, of course, and they came from that explosion of creativity, that explosion of the avant-garde from 1910, but particularly in the early 1920s. And here's David Burlyuk as he found himself in New York after the revolution after traveling across Siberia twice, living in Japan, he found himself in New York, but he never forgot that he was of Ukrainian origin. There are many examples of him painting Cossack Mamai, the symbol of Ukrainian identity. And even after the World War II, he remembered, he recalled his youth in Ukraine and created these nostalgic portraits of Ukraine. Why is this not being recognized? Why is the avant-garde seen as Russian, non-Ukrainian? Until recently, at least. Well, there are a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, the terminology. The Russian Empire is not Russia. Russian Empire included Ukraine, included many nationalities and many peoples, but that terminology has often been used to obliterate the Ukrainian identity. Editing. If you read Malevich's autobiography, he spends half of it talking about how he was influenced in his early life by Ukraine and by Ukrainian art and by folk art and by everything he witnessed. But when you read Malevich's translations of Malevich's autobiography or introductions from that include parts of that autobiography, that first half is always left out. It's only about his life in Moscow or Leningrad. So there's a tradition of editing out the Ukrainian content. Museum practices. You could go to MoMA today and you can see some artists are identified as Ukrainian, others are identified as Russian, born in Ukraine, and there's a constant tug of war about that, the way these artists are to be described. Ukrainian art came out of the Ukrainian Revolution, which was not the Russian Revolution. There was no October Revolution in Ukraine. There was an attempt to create a Ukrainian national culture, a Ukrainian national art institute, a Ukrainian national identity. It was democratic. It was based on folk arts, traditions. It was a revival of a long art history. And that world was created initially in 1917, and it led to the great cultural renaissance of the 1920s. This was an event that was huge in Ukrainian history. It produced hundreds of writers. It produced numerous artists. The 1920s in Ukraine was a flowering of Ukrainian art and culture, but it was liquidated. Those people were arrested at the end of the 20s for nationalism or for excessive interest in formalism or for various other reasons. And most of them were killed. And the art was placed in so-called spetsfonde. It was hidden away in vaults, only to be restored and brought back to life at the end of the 80s when Ukraine became independent. I want to mention finally one interesting and little known aspect of the avant-garde and of Ukrainian modernism. The 1920s was not only a period of Ukrainianization, but is also a period of Yiddishization. Both Ukrainians and Jews were able to develop their literature and their culture. And there was a parallel development. Many artists of Jewish background attended the Kyiv School of Art, and then the great Kulturliga. This was the largest and most important Jewish organization in Ukraine in the 1920s. And there's just this year, just recently, a book of essays has come out about this Kulturliga. This school developed parallel with Mikhailo Boychuk's school of monumentalism. There were many contacts between them. And in the 1920s, they produced a renaissance of both Jewish art and Ukrainian art. It was evident in many ways. Lettering in of the Jewish alphabet and of the Ukrainian alphabet was used in advertising. It was used in book design, book production. This is a cigarette box, sketches. And there was a theory behind it. And this is one of the things I want to stress at the end. Boris Aronson, who was the main theorist of the Kulturliga art group, spoke about Jewish national creativity, especially primitivism, popular art, ornamental motifs, embroidery, kilims, plates, icons, and the Jewish desire for a style of their own, for a cultural autonomy. So he wrote a book published in Berlin in 1924, in which he said that the early stages are imitation, copying, going to synagogues, copying the designs, going to gravestones, copying the designs. The second stage is stylization, and the third stage is individualization, where you use these creatively. Well, the platform of Mikhailo Boychuk's school was exactly the same. Explore cultural roots, the icon, folk arts, primitivism, Neo-Byzantinism, synthesize a national style, or try to synthesize a national style from these, from the archetypes, from the things that are most popular, recode these archetypes and search for a deeper grammar, a grammar of Ukrainian art, in the same way as the Jewish community, the Jewish artists was searching for a deeper grammar of Jewish art. And they presented traditional themes, but always in a modernist, always in an avant-gardist fashion. So you can see the designs for books and for graphic art, which played with traditional imagery but reworked it. And the same happened in art, the same happened in sculpture. So you have Archipenko on the left, you have Mark Epstein in the middle, and you have Tchekhov on the right. Mark Epstein, his work has never been shown in the West. There are hundreds and hundreds of fascinating pieces in Kyiv that have never been taken out. There's room for a wonderful exhibition of his work. So this essentially is what I wanted to show, the richness, the breadth of this early explosion of cultural work, and the fact that it is still being rediscovered, still being revived, and still plays a very important role in Ukrainian art and design. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I would like to thank Sasha, European Union, and the Ukrainian Museum for inviting me to talk about this very important theme. The Ukrainian design has many gaps in the continuity of graphic approaches due to, this is my presentation, okay. Due to the Soviet political pressure, repressions, wars, migrations, and socio-economic crises. In general, the subject of Ukrainian design as well as Ukrainian avant-garde art has the same process of rethinking and assertion in world history. Speaking of design in Ukraine in the 20th, 21st centuries, we have to relate it with the formation of the statehood, the Ukrainian People's Republic, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and Ukraine since independence. Regarding the legacy of graphic artists from the times of the Ukrainian People's Republic and modern Ukraine, there is a direct connection between the usage of the national emblem and general aesthetics, typography, and development of the typefaces. However, the question is raised to the graphic design legacy of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Putin first published an article in which he explained his understanding of history. In his lengthy historical speech, he tried to show that Ukraine doesn't exist and Ukraine was invented by Lenin. In the context of modern Russian colonizing policy, the major narrative is that Ukraine is not another country, but only some version of Russia, and Ukrainians are a kind of version of Russians. During my studies in the 2000s and then in the professional realm, I faced Russian designers who stated that Ukraine did not have its graphic design traditions, school, or manner. Being a Ukrainian graphic designer and forming a certain design tradition, I couldn't accept those claims. Working mostly with cultural projects, I became more captivated by the graphic design history of Ukraine in defining and filling in the gaps and re-educating myself. One of the projects in this field, Znak Ukrainian Trademarks, 1960s to the 80s, I made with my Ukrainian colleagues, graphic designers. As a design research trio, UNA Collective, we aimed to trace the connection between the three historical eras and reveal the Ukrainian graphic tradition. Our main interests were the trademarks in the 1960s to the 80s as a basis of form creation, imagination, and design inventiveness in isolated conditions and as a rather independent sphere from the Soviet ideology. This period could be described as a more elaborated approach to design from the first attempts of the new language created by Ukrainian avant-garde artists in 1920s to 30s to design as discipline. This legacy can be vanished or assigned only to the USSR. It was their significant contribution to the graphic context in Ukraine in particular. For us, it was the driving force to restore and to state that this is Ukrainian heritage and has connection to the Ukrainian avant-garde artists. Decolonizing Ukrainian graphic design from the Soviet era is to declare that modern Ukrainian designers preserve and work with such developments of modernism in Ukraine, aware of the essential roots and go against the colonial Russian policy of denying Ukrainian origin. It is generally accepted that design, art, and architecture in their formation have a very tight connection with landscape, nature, climate, and folklore. Ukrainian graphic designer Volodymyr Pobedin mentioned in his book Marks in Graphic Design that the ornaments for ancient Ukrainian pottery are associated with worshipping the forces of nature, the sun, water, and especially plants. Common elements of the ornament were triangles, the symbol of the arable farming. It is natural to assume that the triangles were dots with dots inside symbolizes a sown field. There are often vessels decorated with a frieze of triangles shaded in different directions. Perhaps this motif is a symbol of a powerful field. There is a very reason to assume that triangles became a specific method of form creation and composition in Ukrainian graphic design as a code mark of how Ukrainian designers were so connected to the land and manifesting its features, especially the richness of the soil. In the times of the Ukrainian People's Republic, Georgy Narbut and Vasyl Krychevsky were among the founders of the Ukrainian Academy of Arts in Kyiv in 1917. Vasyl Kryczewski was the creator of the Ukrainian Art Nouveau style, an architect, a designer in the field of decorative and applied arts, a book artist, a theater and film artist, and the author of the national emblem of Ukraine. Georgi Narbut followed the aesthetics of folklore and traditional ornament and implemented it into book graphics and typefaces. His impact was exceptional on the next generations of graphic artists and designers in defining national style. These images demonstrate the clear connection of form creating in first graphic designs works with national symbols and triangles as the primary shapes. Vasyl Kryczewski Jr. continued such an approach learned from his father in the next period of the Ukrainian state. In this first image, we can see the experiment with typography and graphic composition, which will determine in many ways the specifics of the Ukrainian composition approach. The second image is the intertitle typeface for the movie by the All-Ukrainian Photo Cinema Administration, VUFCU, created by Vasyl Kryczewski Jr. In this typography and graphic shapes, he uses a unique combination of sharp and rounded shapes. It's important to admit that triangles are the basis of the composition. The Bolsheviks established Kharkiv, the city in the northeast of the country, my hometown, as the capital of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1919. In 1921, the Kharkiv Art College officially opened. It was based on the first private school of applied graphics and painting in the Russian Empire, established in 1868. For our discussion, it's important to underline that in January 1922, Vasyl Yermilov, well-known avant-garde artist, headed a graphic studio at the above-mentioned Kharkiv Art College. Vasyl Yermilov is a constructivist. His major interest was in carrying out formal tasks through the use of primary elements of graphic forms, mostly triangles, and typefaces, and experiments with form and texture. Vasyl Yermilov's experiments stood out in its emotion and increased decorativeness and a sense of connection with Ukrainian applied arts. Since 1925, in Yermilov's graphic studio, another well-known Ukrainian artist, Ivan Padelka, has started his teaching. Like Vasyl Yermilov, he made monumental painting, decorating celebrations, and illustrating books and magazines. His focus was on ornamental, plain techniques and the graphic style of Ukrainian popular prints. This example of the cover shows the specifics of form creating in typeface using sharp and elongated serifs in the letter D in triangle form. The opposite approaches of these two artists in the studio classes were shaping the new system of training for future designers and manifesting a distinctive national character. Thus, this was the invented formula of Ukrainian graphic design and its features and phenomena. The school, with its methodology, was declared, but due to Stalin's repressions, Ivan Padelkas was executed on charges of counter-revolutionary activities related to his Ukrainian nationalism in 1937, and Vasyl Yermilov was terminated from teaching and was morally broken. In 1949, he was expelled from the Union of Artists on charges of cosmopolitanism. Stalin's repressions, ideological dictate, and World War II brought advanced approaches in graphic arts into obscurity, depriving the professional area of distinguished artists in Ukraine. A decorative approach in the graphic field was dominating as an image of a happy life in socialist realism. As an example of graphics of that period is Moisei Fradkin's works. He was a student of Vasyl Yermilov and Ivan Padelka. In his graphics of Trademarks, one can see the following of the ideological requirement and decorativeness on the other side, keeping Yermilov's and Padalka's methods on this composition. The 1960s was the Soviet period of the so-called thaw, and according to the economic policy by decree of the USSR Council of Ministry on May 15th, in 1962, on trademarks, obligated enterprises to mark their goods on the packaging. The necessity of studies of non-figurative art approach and partial rehabilitation of the 1920 to 30s avant-garde in the graphic essence brought Vasily Yermilov back to teaching at the reorganized Kharkiv Art College in Kharkiv Institute of Art and Industry in 1963. For decades in the USSR, design practices were subordinated to state organizations such as USSR Chamber of Commerce and Industry and All-Union Scientific Research Institute of Technical Aesthetics (VNITE) with a center in Moscow. The next generation of graphic artists, so-called industrial graphics, not yet graphic designers, because the term has not been officially endorsed, became players in developing graphic design in Ukraine. As a consequence of the industrial graphics separation from graphic art was the appearance of numerous works of unknown authors. Among the many works, one can highlight the works referring to Ukrainian graphics of the 1920s to 30s. In the 70s, marks became laconic shapes with the expressiveness of a black and white ratio. One of the most distinguished and leading designers of the time in the Kharkiv Chamber of Commerce and Industry and a professor of the Kharkiv Institute of Art and Industry was Volodymyr Pobedin. He was a Moisei Fratkin student and inherited this approach of form creation. He had a wide practice in industrial graphics, but trademarks were his real passion. He was one of the first ones in Ukraine who retreated from narrative composition while heeding his quest toward creating symbolic marks. Pobedin explored the graphic languages of ancient culture in Ukraine, and in such an approach he enriched his works with the local context. We see how this triangle shape forms the best examples of the trademarks of the time. I can add that in 2003 I also was his student. Yevgen Nadezdin was also a leading designer in trademark graphics and one of the professors of the Kharkiv Institute of Art and Industry. Nadezdin graduated from Lviv State Institute of Applied and Decorative Arts. He gained the ceramist specialty. Applied arts, which is rooted in ancient crafts, made a significant impact on his approach to graphic form creation. His trademarks correspond to the shapes of the Lviv School of Ceramics. It was an exceptional contribution to graphic design as the Ukrainian approach. The works of Nadezdin as well as Pobedin were created in the Soviet period of so-called stagnation and prove that sphere of industrial graphics was mostly liberated from Soviet ideology symbols. Perestroika and its economic liberalization allowed designers to create their studios, so their client was free to choose the contractor. With new motifs of computer technologies in the late 1980s and early 90s, new symbols were brought. In this slide, we can see such new graphic elements which were prevailed, like these marks with resembled a formula image. But also we can admit such a connection to the graphics of the 1920s, the dynamic and tension, the tendency to use sharp shapes with triangles in bases were preserved in the consciousness of the Ukrainian designers, and the manifestations of the tradition are obvious. This review allows us to assert that despite the efforts of the colonial policy of the Soviet Union, Ukrainian graphic design has developed the unique approach to composition and its unique graphic language. This is what created the graphic tradition of Ukraine designers, which is rooted in folk culture but does not follow the superficial national stereotypes imposed by the colonialists. The study and development of this tradition is the essence of the process of decolonization of Ukrainian design in modern Ukraine. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. First of all, I am really grateful for organizers of this event for this very important topic, and I know that there are a lot of people who would like to hear all of these lectures and all of this presentation, but they are unable to be here. I received a lot of requests from my friends from Ukraine that they would like to explore this information as well, so maybe there is any chance to share it to other people, because I believe that it's a very important topic. And today I'm going to talk about graphic design since independence. This period of time is not described very well, and there is very limited number of written resources telling about this period of time. So I encourage researchers, art critics, writers, journalists to pay attention to this period of time, because now it looks like they prefer to write about dead designers and a bit neglect those who are alive and important today. And I would like to share my story, my experience, and probably it will give you some information to start research in the future. So after Ukraine gained independence in 1991, so probably some of you remember that time where everything was completely broken, and we had to start right from the beginning. So Ukrainian design started with falsified, distorted, or even destroyed heritage. Ukrainian design started with complete absence of relevant design education and interrupted traditions, art tradition, design traditions. There was complete disconnection between business and design. And at that time, there was complete disrespect of copyrights, and also there was huge pressure first of all, in a cultural way from Russia, and really noticeable neglect from the Western world, as Western world didn't know about Ukraine at that time, and basically nobody cared about Ukrainian design. So Ukrainian designers had to start basically from scratch, reinventing design. The most significant feature of that period of time is rapidly changing landscape, where the environment was so dynamic that basically you cannot really track what is going on. And I would describe the whole period of independence Ukraine with a time frame divided on circles that last 3 to 5 years. And those circles depends on economical growth or decline in the country. And during every circles, new designers and design studios emerged and disappeared. And because there was no any written history during this time, basically every new generation, a new generation in every cycle, barely know about designers from the previous cycle. So it means that this a design tradition is always interrupted. That didn't allow Ukrainian design to develop in a natural way, I think. Because of that very unstable situation, only small design studios were able to survive. And probably you know that until today there are no big design agency like you can see in Western countries. And also, because of this higher level of insecurity, a lot of designers had to immigrate or even change the profession. But there were also positive features. So the main positive feature is that, I know it sounds weird, but the disconnection between business and creativity gave huge design freedom to Ukrainian designers. I mean that, like, even when business orders some design, they don't really believe in the power of design, and because of that it gives designers freedom to create the most, I would say, like dangerous and risky projects. The next great feature that helped Ukrainian design is availability of materials and technologies with relatively higher quality and lower price. It allows higher accessibility to production. It means that compared to Western world, Ukrainian designers were able to produce really interesting things. And the last thing that helped Ukrainian design to survive, it's I think, like, desire of Ukrainians to change this world for better. So Ukrainians lived for such a long period of time in misery and some restrictions and questionable economical environment that they really strive to create a better world, and they are ready to even to work for free, to volunteer for better future. And now I would like to describe a different period of time and give you a feeling what's going on since gaining the independence in 1991. So the 90s and early 2000s are known for crazy experiments, mainly in designs, mainly in poster design and magazines. It was time of counterculture, when designers tried to challenge boundaries and try to explore what is allowed, what is not allowed, what can be accepted by society and what not. There was huge influence by Russian design at that time, and not only Russian design, also Russian contemporary art. But even at that time, Ukrainian art directors are trying to give a platform to national Ukrainian photographers, illustrators, and of course designers. Also at that time, there is no any available information about branding, about corporate identity. And Ukrainian designer had to collect this information from all possible resources. And this is a period of time when Ukrainians just try to understand what is branding, what is brand guidelines, how to work with this. And here you can see some examples of most noticeable identities of that time that were visible on the street of Kyiv. Also at that period of time, Ukrainian design became visible also in Russia. And I would say that first Ukrainian stars of graphic design appeared. The next period of time, it's late 2000, are known for creating the first commercial phones by Ukrainian designers and by presenting those commercial phones to wide audience. So I remember when this one just appeared on my phones, it was just like an explosion because it was so fresh, so new. It was 100% modern, but in the same time with a strong Ukrainian roots. Also, this is my work. Also, at that time, Ukrainian design appeared on world map. So that project, I think, was the first Ukrainian project that went viral and gained millions impressions online. The 10th years. Ukrainian design, commercial design, became stronger, more and more agency became visible, and more agency are getting achievements on international levels. At that time also a lot of private courses and private school appeared. So designers try to get education and offer education. And it's not just like, I would say, that education that is not connected to reality. So first of all, it's education that you can use in your everyday practice. Education that you, basically like education that all of you to earn money right here, right now. Also at that time, book design became visible. More and more Ukrainian agencies are working on creating really cool books, and those books are appreciated on international level. Those books receive appreciations far abroad. Also in after 2014, there were a lot of talks about war. Ukrainian designers already at that time started to communicate this topic and trying to discuss it on all possible levels. Like, for example, this book is trying to represent how to talk about war with kids. Also at that time, a lot of Ukrainian designers became politically cautious, and they started boycott any connection with Russia. The majority of Ukrainian designers broke any collaboration with Russian clients or Russian design agency. Those Ukrainians who had some educational courses in Russia, they stopped doing that. And that, I think, was the moment of the beginning to understand that we have our own way, and we can be independent, not only like a country, but independent like I would say art movement, design movement in general. The late 10s are known for the first successful project that were created to represent Ukraine officially on international level. So, for example, like this identity for Eurovision competition. Also, during this period of time, there were a lot of tries and very high attention to territorial brandings. More and more designers, just not only designers, like marketing specialists, people who work in tourist industries, they started to discuss territorial branding, and more attention were directed to that topic. Also, more and more designers are fond of calligraphy, lettering, and creating some innovative typography, very often with some reference to Ukrainian heritage. During that period of time, a lot of research were started. I mean that Ukrainians understood that they had history, the history that they don't know at that moment, and they tried to look back and understand what was done before them. Early 20s represent successful design collaboration with the government. I think this is probably the first project that was really necessary, really cool, very well executed and presented by the government. More and more designers work for creating huge type families, and typographic design became more and more complex. Commercial packaging design branding became more and more connected to business, and business started to understand, probably finally, that design is a powerful tool for promoting goods and services. But then, 24th of February, when Russia started full-scale invasion, the life of Ukrainian creatives changed forever. A lot of them had to flee from Ukraine, and maybe forever. And many of those who immigrated to, I shouldn't say immigrated, like moved to other countries, probably they will not be back, and they had to change their, not to change, like adapt their talent to serve the needs of other countries. Also, a lot of designers had to switch their attention to informational war. So instead of creating, I don't know, some instead of creating something that can bring better future, can bring, I don't know, like joy and better quality of life, they had to speak with the language of hate in a way of protection. So when I say the language of hate, I mean like a hate like protection. Marcella Mozhina organized very cool archive of old Ukrainian graphics. It's called Znadibke, available on Facebook. And this is a very good example how that archive inspired her to restore historical typeface to create the whole set. And those typefaces was used by Ukrainian forces in their brand identity, like one of official fonts. More and more designers working on topics to highlight the war to the international level. So with this war, Ukraine received kind of platform to be visible, to be heard, to be understood. And Ukraine in general, Ukrainian design received huge support from the Western countries. But in the same time, huge gap in communication became visible. And Ukrainian designers in the state of war are trying to speak with the language of pain. So they try to scream about all tragedies that are happening in Ukraine right now. And the Western world, despite the fact that they want to help Ukraine, they prefer to speak the language of joy and wealthy life. And even if they want to help Ukrainian, there is gap of misunderstanding between Ukrainian design and Western community. So saying that, I want to say that yes, Ukrainian designers are very grateful for support from the Western world, but in the same time, it's visible that too often this support is not really relevant, or is not what we need. Also, we need to understand that sooner or later this war will be over, and we need to understand how we should proceed with Ukrainian design to go to the bright future. So should we continue to speak with the language of pain, or should we stop and try to create and offer to the world something else besides tragedy? So how many designers that moved abroad will be ready to move back to Ukraine? And will they be ready to share the knowledge that they received abroad? And can Ukrainian design keep attention of the world the way we have now? With these words, I want to say Slava Ukraini, Heroям Slava, and let's work, let's create Ukrainian design, and let's do something positive. And besides having the war, besides having the tragedy, let's find the language how to present Ukraine to the world and how to be heard. Thank you.
So we're going to do a quick setup. There you go. First of all, thank you, all three of you, for these amazing, amazing, and very thoughtful presentations. I really appreciate your time and generosity of sharing this stuff. So I would like to start with a few questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. I might just hop in there and then pass the microphone around for our recording and for the folks on Zoom or YouTube, same thing. So the kind of the three topics that I'd like to cover in terms of the discussion around decolonization, ideas of national identity, national building, rebuilding, perhaps, soft power, and the processes of decolonization. And I want to start with something that I touched on a little bit in my opening remarks, the idea that Ukraine, to, I think, the world's surprise, was able to halt a very aggressive and very powerful invasion and gained quite a bit of support for that and applause. And I think what that implies to me, at least, is that the process of decolonization within Ukraine has been going on for a few years at least, and I think that we just saw a little bit of that too in Yurko's presentation about kind of the post-independent design. So I think that there's already a pretty strongly defined national identity that maybe was latent up until the invasion, and I think maybe it was much more catalyzed as any wars have the ability to do that. Certainly in this case since 2014, kind of laying the groundwork for catalyzing this and sort of, I think, priming the public in Ukraine to be more aware of their own identity and the strength that they have. And so my question, I guess, to everyone on the panel here, what do you think the role of media, design, and visual communication play in perhaps preparing the country for this invasion? Do you think that it's by messaging through cultural institutions, through messaging through civic institutions, organically working with the government, as we just saw in the last couple of slides? So maybe we'll start from left to right. Yurko, what do you think the design's role wasn't perhaps getting the country a little bit more ready and aware of who they are? Did design kind of play a role in that, or visual communication?
Sorry, like.
Do you think the let's say the last decade, or perhaps since 2014, the visibility and kind of the attention of Ukrainian designers about Ukraine and centering, I guess, Ukraine versus Russia versus the West, do you think that played a role in shaping the national identity and allowing the country to stand up to this aggression in the way that they did?
So, as I said during my presentation, we received like a huge attention. Like we entered the big stage, and now it's a very good time to give a speech to the whole world. And basically, today we are talking about decolonizing, so it's like a really good chance to, at least to start this process, or at least to understand what's going on for ourselves. But as I said during the presentation, we are at this moment like talking a bit different languages with the Western world. And for us, it's very important to find this connection, because it's really great to talk about decolonizing of Ukraine in a group of Ukrainians. But the most efficient approach is to engage other people, other country to this topic, because the idea of decolonizing, it's not to tell to ourselves that we are independent, we are different, we are Ukrainian, we have history. It's about being part of the international world. It's about finding our place on the map, and it's about to be treated the way we deserve.
And Aliona, for you, a similar question, and maybe like adding, in the agencies and Ukrainian design studios, have you seen a shift away, and how long do you think that's been going on, really kind of turning away from Russian influence on these studios, and maybe perhaps even away from Western influence, because that's like obviously a very central thing in graphic design. The bigger hotspots across the world always kind of play a bigger influence on smaller markets, and everyone kind of looks up to them.
I can say that the first shifts from Russian influence started in 2004, when I was a student in Kharkiv Academy of Design and Arts, and since my generation of graduates, we stopped to go to Moscow to make our careers, and we became more focused on Ukraine. And after Orange Revolution, more graduates from Kharkiv were really interested to go to Kyiv. And after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, Kyiv became a center of design industry in Ukraine, and mostly all of the designers in Ukraine, they were more interested in created Ukrainian design, and this dream of Moscow just really gone, and it was just in previous generations, in previous decades of designers. But I can say that Ukrainian designers of my generation and younger, but we have this shift from Western design. I think that now it's we're in interesting dialogue, and we are more involved in these international practices. And Ukrainian designers now, a lot of young designers, they are more experienced, and they can really promote and propose more persuasive solutions and to be equal players in international design.
And does language play a role? I mean, perhaps since 2014, like in let's say the studio culture within Ukrainian design, my understanding has always been that the Russian was the more dominant, let's say, spoken language in the studios. Has that shifted? Has that changed for both of your experiences within the design tradition kind of office culture? Do people speak predominantly?
Well, I moved to Kyiv in 2012, and Yeah, I started to work in, it was current Dutch design and Federative Agency, this first years of this agency, and it was really my first experience when I started communicate Ukrainian in office, and yeah, maybe it was a really big shift since that time.
Yurko, do you see like a much bigger shift to a Ukrainian dominantly kind of spoken in design studios? Do people like, you know, do designers speak to each other in Ukrainian much more than in Russian?
Sorry, can you please speak louder? Because
Of course. Do you see, just in terms of language spoken, like do studios and designers speak Ukrainian much more than they did ever before?
You mean like language?
I mean, it seems like maybe an obvious
Like,
question, but it's curious
it's a bit
to me.
like a, I guess, painful topic for me. There is my sister and business partner in the audience, and I believe that we launched our studio in 2005, and it's very weird because we are probably the oldest Ukrainian-speaking studio of Ukraine. So we spoke Ukrainian since the date when we were founded, and it's so unique, it's so weird to be a Ukrainian agency and speak Ukrainian. Also, we did a lot of effort to promote Ukrainian language, so we, for example, a lot of our colleagues that had their own design agencies, sooner or later they needed Ukrainian agreements, like to work with clients, because all agreements they had were in Russian, and we helped them by sharing our agreements in Ukrainian language. And also on our website we published brief, like a questionnaire for design project in Ukrainian for like an open source, so people can use it. So I think that being Ukrainian is very important. And also I remember it was very irritating when we answered by phone, like Доброго дня, студія Yurko Gutsulyak, and oh, you're not from Kyiv? Yes, so I believe that Ukrainian language should be not the first language, the only language in Ukraine. And I think that it's very important that Ukrainian design should work with Ukrainian language first of all.
Myroslav, for kind of a kind of piggybacking question, do you see like the influence on the Ukrainian culture coming from other fields, let's say music or cinema, literature? Certainly there's a very rich tradition of contemporary Ukrainian writers who are getting a lot of visibility in the West. Do you see their adoption kind of language, of course, first and foremost, but do you see them, that cultural sector, maybe, let's say, parallel to graphic design and advertising, does that play another kind of significant role in contributing to the national identity?
Yeah, of course it does. And it's always been, culture is always multivalent, multi-leveled. It's a project that where every sector helps the other sector. And certainly there have been, I think, breakthroughs. Ukrainian cinema is now making wonderful films and having successes at international gatherings. It's winning prizes. Ukrainian literature is being translated and you know, is vastly appreciated in the West. There are many aspects to the way Ukrainians are now seen, viewed, heard. The music. There's a wonderful annual festival in New York of Ukrainian new music, experimental music. So all these things help. All are coming together to raise the profile of Ukrainian culture. But as I was listening to Yurko and Aliona, I was thinking, this, This is so much like what the Ukrainians tried to do in the 1920s, before this cultural renaissance was cut off. They were desperate to break out to the West, to show their works in the West, to be seen as Ukrainian artists, as Ukrainian theater, as Ukrainian cinema in the West. And they did have successes until this was cut short. They also thought of themselves internationally. They did not think of themselves as a sort of local culture, a culture that was hemmed in. They thought of themselves as part of Western modernism, Western avant-garde. That drive was successful up to a point, and the Ukrainianization that Yurko mentioned was successful. It was gaining momentum, and it was all stopped. It was all ended. It was all put down, and so we have a throwback to using Russian, to making Ukrainian culture only a culture for domestic production, domestic consumption, and this sort of stereotype of Ukrainians as non-urban, as only capable of entertaining at a very low level. That was imposed after the 30s and later. So it's fascinating to see how in every generation Ukrainians fight back, and they create, the new generation comes along and does something spectacular and pushes the boundaries. And then unfortunately we have recolonization, the empire comes back. It wants it polices the boundaries of what is permissible, and it sort of pushes Ukrainians back into what the empire thinks is acceptable. So there are many, many interesting parallels with the past.
And switching maybe perhaps like to this idea of like soft power, as you just touched on, like the recentering of the empire using this incredible war chest of money that Russia has had and the influence it's had. Do you see that certainly kind of in your experience in the academic level, how perhaps the Slavic departments, how small, underfunded, I would say, Ukrainian departments are?
Yeah, that's true. But on the other hand, there's a huge discussion now about how to decolonize Slavic studies, East European studies, Russian studies, and this has made this field a field where these discussions take place openly, and they're very heated. They're very dynamic right now. So there is a sense that one has to change these fields, and this is something that is happening, not just in history departments or language departments and literature departments, but it is percolating through universities, I think throughout the world. But there are many aspects to this. First of all, there is an older generation of scholars who are slow to change. There's a need to hire Ukrainianists, or bona fide Ukrainians, people who really know something about Ukraine. And there's a need to change the Western culture generally. I mean, I'll tell you one incident. There was a huge Kazimir Malevich exhibition in the Tate Modern a couple of years back. Huge. It was a big thing. And I went to it. It was quite impressive. All the way through, I read great Russian artists, Russian soul, Russian spirit, Russian talent. the word Russian was mentioned all the way through. Not once was anything said about his Ukrainian background or his Ukrainian origins or his Ukrainian inspiration. And just as you left the exhibition, on the wall there was a poster from the Bolshevik period of a crucified a woman representing crucified Ukraine with blood dripping from her and a crown of thorns on her head, and Petlura drinking the blood of crucified Ukraine. Had nothing to do with Malevich, but it had everything to do with the portrayal of Russian high culture, Malevich, and ugly Ukraine. The only good thing was that there was a young Ukrainian woman at the exit explaining to everybody that this was propaganda and challenging everybody to think about what they had just seen. But this exhibition was funded by a Russian oligarch. I mean, they have places on boards, they have access to these works, and there is a project, a Russian project of soft power, as you say. It's going to take a long time to change that.
Yeah, it's like if you for anyone who's a skeptic, and I don't think there are skeptics in this audience, but in 2013, the term soft power officially was entered into the Russian foreign policy concept. Like, it's enshrined in their statehood. It's like how they view the foreign policy, and it states that it is a comprehensive toolkit for achieving foreign policy objectives, building on civil society potential, information, cultural, and other methods and technologies alternative to traditional diplomacy. This is what the Russians explicitly state and act on. So it's not surprising that I think that this is happening. This is very much a very concentrated kind of tactic. So I'm going to ask Aliona kind of a question sort of around that. Can and should Ukraine utilize the same strategies? And perhaps it's already doing that.
Yeah, we are doing that, and empathy and sympathy are based on visibility, and as for design, it is important to present Ukrainian approaches and to distinguish it from Russian.
The sort of in preparing for this, I saw kind of an interesting statistic. Monaco magazine, there's a few rankings of soft power, because it's a very important topic. But Monaco magazine, one of the four that does the rankings of soft power, their survey for 2022, which is quite recent, lists Ukraine in the top 10. So U.S. is number one. It's always number one in every field, but certainly in soft power. Ukraine is number 10. It's in the top 10. So it does say, I think, a lot about what has been going on in terms of trying to, I think, shift the conversation, kind of reverse that. And Yurko, you and I, in the last time we met, we talked a little bit about like soft power in other spheres, like you mentioned in your slides, the Eurovision, it's a rotating, whoever wins the event, the country gets to host the following year's event. And so it was in Kyiv. You mentioned this idea of the visibility of soft power, the Ukrainian force of soft power that is visible through these other spaces. Of course, design in terms of branding plays a role, but can you speak a little bit about that, like your impression of what you've seen in the cultural sector of soft power by Ukraine, in the way that it affects the Western view?
So actually the term soft power has the word power, that it means like to deliver some energy that can change anything. And probably the big problem of Ukrainians and all Ukrainians community that I saw abroad is that they try to keep this power for themselves. I live in North America for 6 years in Canada, and what I see that there is huge interest to Ukraine from local people, from Canadians, from Americans, but Ukrainian culture is very inaccessible. The majority of events that are offered to audience is very close, with very little promotion, and also very pricey. So like talking about Eurovision, I managed to have a group of friends that are big fans of this European competition, and a lot of Ukraine, they know all Ukrainian singers, they know probably even more than I know. They know like all songs, like some words, and they really want to see their concert, but all Ukrainian concert in Canada is like 2-3 times more expensive than any other singers. So it looks like that Ukrainians are just trying to keep our culture for themselves and avoid sharing it. So we shouldn't be selfish, and the most important thing just to share our culture. Only when we share, we can use it as a power, and then we can make it soft.
And I think, as you said in the end of your presentation, there's an opportunity now. The world is paying attention, and what do we give to them? What's the perspective that we give to them? So I think that's a very interesting way to think about this. I wanted to switch to kind of our maybe closing question for the roundtable and open up to questions, but I'm going to maybe delve into the idea of institutional or decolonization, or the processes of decolonization at institutional and individual level. And we just touched on soft power and how it plays a role, but I think it's very evident in construction kind of perception of healthy democratic republics or healthy democratic liberal states. They usually have a very independent and vibrant civic institutions, which I think is something that the world is looking for Ukraine and is often calling out as if it's not really there, or sort of this lens of corruption that's kind of tainting things. And again, I think if you really look closely, there are pretty vibrant and healthy institutions, not without their flaws, but it is a pretty crucial role in a healthy society. And with the eventual end of the war, which I hope will be soon, rebuilding and shoring up these liberal institutions is going to be a very central project and I'm sure it's already kind of in the works. Aliona, for you, in terms of the lens of institutional level and institutional support, do you see Ukrainian institution support, maybe this is like a big thing, but decolonizing of design industry? Do you see the way that national organizations, and again, we saw a few examples in Yurko's slides of very close collaboration between the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian designers and type designers. Do you see a shift that's happened in the last few years?
Yes, there is such shift, and actually I work with cultural institutions in Ukraine, and they support Ukrainian designers and work with designers who mostly are involved in this process of studying Ukrainian design history, archives, and in this way institutions want to have design really and more specific approach. And also it's very important to admit that some years ago, Ukrainian institutions, they refused to use Russian typefaces, and it's also a very important shift and move to our typeface designers, and it's a really great contribution for Ukrainian designers to work on Ukrainian Cyrillic, and so it's pretty challenging, but they have now a lot of work to do. Yeah, and it's like requests mostly from Ukrainian institutions.
Yeah, it's incomparable to see how many Ukrainian type designers there are these days, and there's a wonderful platform called Rent-A-Font that is run by Ukrainian design studio, and you can find thousands of Ukrainian made designs of typefaces, certainly for Cyrillic, but also Western Latin scripts. And Yurko, in sort of the idea of institutions. Or let's say like switching from an institution to the individual in relationship to the institution, what do you think designers in Ukraine can do to liberate themselves from this and this kind of Russian-centric kind of structure? What do you think would be the best strategy for them to start to decolonize their processes, their work?
So definitely the first step of liberation should be language. And at the second step, it should be typography that is based on language. It's interesting to mention some like a little scandal that happened online probably half year ago when Ukrainian designers brought to the audience examples of interesting historical typographic experiments, like to admire them, maybe to interpret them, maybe to redesign them in a modern way, and then how Russian designers try to join that conversation and try to tell that, oh, it's such a good examples of Ukrainian typography, we need to include them into a book about Russian design. It's like immediately. And they received like a huge attack from Ukrainian side. There was like a pretty good online scandal with popcorn. But I just, at that moment, I just thought to myself, wow, how fast they react. So they just saw a beautiful example of Ukrainian typography, and immediately they have idea to publish book about Russian like typography and include these examples. And I think it's something that we need to learn and to liberate ourselves. First of all, we need to learn probably to react fast, and then we need to learn to speak out and to protect our territory, basically. And yes, I understand that we have limited resources, and probably that's prevent us from fast reaction, but still we need to work more on creating some Ukrainian publication, maybe some Ukrainian events, I don't know, whatever. So more is better.
And since we are in an educational institution, Myroslav, for a question for you in terms of what is the role of Western institutions, certainly academic institutions, in helping decolonizing even here? It's not just in Ukraine. What do you think the institutions can do or should be doing?
Well, I think they need to give a greater voice to Ukrainians and Ukrainian projects. That has to be across the board, you know, whatever people are doing, music, art, design, I mean, literature, they need to understand that Ukrainians do have a voice, they do have something to say, and they want to be part of this wider conversation. And what people can do in the West is just to insist that that happens. There is a need for a greater education, because for many people, they still don't really get it. You know, they don't really understand how Ukraine is different. Is it really different from Russia? Why don't you want to be called Russian, and so on? So there's a large educational project that has to take place there. But it is happening, and Western institutions are quite aware of the need for change. One has to simply identify the individuals that one can work with, that are interested and able to do this work. And it's not just, you know, sometimes it's just people in departments, say academic departments, who understand the problem. They may be from Czechoslovakia or the former Czechoslovakia. They may be from Poland. They may be from the Baltics. They may be from Bulgaria. But they understand what's going on and they want to help. Sometimes it's Ukrainian emigres. Sometimes there are all kinds of people that are attuned to what Ukraine means, why it's important, and are willing to help. One has to draw on that reservoir of good support, of good feeling, of sympathy. And I also think that people like Aliona and Yurko are doing very important work. They can use the goodwill in the West. Sometimes it's diaspora, so-called diaspora Ukrainian. I never think of myself as a diaspora. I was born in England and I feel like I'm British or Canadian. But there are people of Ukrainian background who they call diaspora Ukrainians who can help, and they can be a bridge, they can be an amplifier. So this process of bringing together people who can make things happen is going on and needs to go on for much longer.
Great, thank you. Are there questions in the audience? I'll be happy to pass the microphone to you if you have any questions you'd like to ask us or any of the panelists. Thank you.
So my question is about kind of decolonization in maybe the bigger picture. And this is kind of a question for, I suppose, all three. Do you find any inspiration or any allies from other countries who are kind of going through a decolonization process? So like Kazakhstan or Estonia or Georgia. I mean, those are very different situations, but do you see any parallels? Do you have any connections? Do you find any inspiration, or do you have any allies from other places who are kind of going through colonization from the former Soviet Union?
Yeah, I'm teaching a course on Ukrainian Empire at Columbia, and one of the things that I give students to read is precisely statements by scholars from other parts of what used to be the Soviet Union, other approaches to how Russian imperial thought and Russian imperial attitudes can be challenged. There are people writing in academia from those perspectives, from the perspective of Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, from the perspective of Polish scholarship. There are people out there doing that, and they are supporters. And there are people, Russians, who are appalled by what Putin is doing, by this war, who are supportive of Ukraine and Ukrainians. So they're out there, but they're not getting the voice is not being put on the front page enough, There is this sort of tacit grinding of the old wheels, the same people teaching the same courses, speaking about the same things over and over again, and quietly, persistently demanding that Russia and Russians are taught, their culture is taught more than all these others, So that's going to take a while to overcome.
So, talking about similar examples from the post-Soviet Union countries, I probably should say that Ukraine has the richest art heritage, design heritage. So it's very difficult to compare what we have to any other country. So talking about, I don't know, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they don't have such a huge artistic power. So probably I can mention Armenia. So talking about post-Soviet Union countries, it's my subjective perception, but I think I would place Armenia on the second place after Ukraine. And they have their unique language, unique alphabet, so they try to keep it. Also, they try to be focused on their local market. And they have some agency and they have some good designers who can compete on international level, who can present something. And talking about their experience of decolonizing, they don't have such experience because they don't resist Russia the way Ukraine do. So probably Ukraine is the richest and the most resistant country. That's why it's difficult to find some similarities.
Well, I can add that as for Baltic countries, I collaborated with a designer from Lithuania, and he also was a contributor in our project Znak, and it was for me it was very interesting to know more about their context. And also I can add that Georgian typefaces really inspire me, and if, for example, as example, not from graphic design but from fashion, as Demna Gutsulyak, designer from Georgia, how he changed this Georgia visible in terms of his also refugee status, and put this voice in international context. So this is very, very interesting to explore also.
Any other questions from? Maybe one last question I can just ask in terms of education, the institutions, educational institutions in Ukraine. What do you think is happening within? It seems like there's a few. I don't know if it's the right framing, but like unofficial, kind of more moving away from the old tradition of art schools being the center for design teaching and doing something that's more, I don't know if, again, grassroots is not the right word, but something that's more commercially driven, something that is independent of an academic structure. Do you see that happening, and that will change, hopefully, design education in Ukraine?
I believe that design education is very important tool in decolonizing. I don't know, can we call education a tool? But the problem with education in Ukraine is that there is disconnection of formal education and marketing needs. That's why there is probably like some formal education, like to get some art knowledge. And there are private schools who try to be relevant to contemporary market. And both of them have, I guess, some issues with relevance. So to have education that can help decolonizing, I think those two types of education should be merged. So the classical education should be more modern and more flexible, because contemporary world, especially commercial world, change extremely fast. And classical education is not flexible enough to follow this contemporary market. And private schools who try to be relevant, they are too on the surface and they don't give the deep knowledge. So I believe to have education as a powerful tool for decolonizing, we need to find a way how to merge those two types.
In our book, Znak, me and my UNA collective colleagues, we decided to show how these studies of archives can be useful for designers. So we made different experiments with trademarks of the Soviet period in Ukraine, and we transformed them and worked with them in different mediums. We made videos, we made color compositions, we made stencils and murals. So I think this could be also a very interesting approach for educational process, not just to learn about design and read about this only in the books or listen to lectures, but also to make such exercises with different form creation, compositions, and to use archives as a tool.
Don't know why you're looking at me. Yeah, I'll just say I think that the Ukrainians that now find themselves in the West are going to have a tremendous influence on the new Ukraine after Ukraine's victory in this war. They have learned and they have assimilated so much that is valuable and important. And when that information gets back or contributes to the ferment in Ukraine, it will change things enormously. I also think that graphic art, poster art, has already done a tremendous amount. Everybody, if anybody knows anything about Ukrainian art, it's often poster art. The art of the Maidan or the Maidans has been shown around the world. It's very effective, it's very powerful, and it has changed perceptions of Ukraine. That's an indication of how the education of people in the West and people in Ukraine is being affected all the time by the art itself. And I think it's inspiring. I think Ukrainian creativity is evident everywhere. And it's really remarkable in its quality and its reach. So it bodes well for the future.
Thank you all three for a very rich expose, and thank you all for coming. I hope you took away something new. Ukrainian Museum, thank you so much for creating this series and giving us space to do this. So have a great night, everyone. Bye.